Okay, so you're wrapping things up on your mix and you're trying to get it louder. You then go to your mix or master bus and you throw in a limiter. You notice that you're still not commercially competitive from a loudness standpoint to these other records. Well, I'm going to show you a technique or trick that could address the issue that you're facing within your mix that's preventing you from getting it competitively loud like the other commercial records. Check this out. Okay, so long story short, here's a session. I have some drums dialed up. What I'm going to do is I want you to pay attention to this aux right here that says drums. This is where all my drums are feeding. And what I want you to do is pay attention to the peak volume of these drums. I'm going to show you the effect before and after. This is without. Pay attention to the loudness of the record and to the peak volume. Without first, without the technique. And now with the technique. Pay attention to the peak volume. So what you noticed that both were hitting at the same exact peak. So I wasn't losing any headroom, but the perceived loudness of the actual drums was far greater with the effect than without it. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna bypass the effect back and forth within the context of the actual song. And I want you to listen to this and remember it to yourself. They're both hitting at the same exact peak. One just feels and has a louder perception as far as the drums than the other. Check this out. So without first. So a huge difference, but remember, they're both hitting at the same exact peak. Now, why is that important? Why do I keep bringing that up? The reason why I keep bringing that up is because this. When you go to your mix at the end, as far as that mix bus, and you decide to yourself, time to get it loud, or you're just using a limiter to get things louder, what's happening is, without this effect, you're basically going into that limiter, and the limiter has to work harder in order for you to get that loudness that you're looking for. But with this technique that I have here, that shout out to Tizio, who really opened my eyes to this, with this technique, it's basically allowing me to limit the dynamics of the drum sound, thus giving me the chance to get that perceived loudness out of my drums, and then allowing me to not have my limiter work so hard to achieve that volume. So what I'm going to show you is this. I'm going to walk you through the whole technique and also show you kind of like the ideology and just the entire scope of it, so you can have an understanding of the technique and not only just see it for what it is. So just to show you what I mean as far as not letting your limiter work so hard because you're limiting the dynamics on the drum sound to get the perception of the volume louder, check this out. I'm going to open up my final limiter. So this is the final limiter that is on the song, and this is what the drums are running into at the very end. So I want you to pay attention to what it was from a gain reduction standpoint as far as how much limiting was happening before the effect, and then how much limiting is happening after the effect. Check this out. Without first. Remember, this is our final limiter. So check out this final limiter as far as the gain reduction that's happening. So you saw the biggest peak catching itself at about 1.4 dB of gain reduction. Now let's put the effect on. Remember, it's louder also, and it's at the same peak. Let's see if the limiter is working harder or less, or what is happening with the final limiter with this new perceived volume that we did on this drum. Check this out. Remember, negative 1.4 dB was the loudest or the biggest catch as far as gain reduction, as far as limiting was happening on the mix bus. Now, so you're seeing the biggest catch or the biggest peak now with the limiter is actually less than it was before with 1.2 dB of limiting. This is so powerful. This really was a game changer for me personally. You know, really big shout out to Tizio for this. All credit to the guy. Opening my mind to, if you have a sound that is eating up a lot of headroom, chances are it's going to be very difficult to get it louder, because your limiter is going to work so much harder in order for you to get it loud, because it's so dynamic. Now, if we take that same sound and we lessen the dynamics of it, meaning the difference between the loudest sound and the quietest sound, we close that gap just a little bit and push it up in the mix, we get a sound that's a little bit more cohesive, more concise, and tighter dynamically, that gives and allows the limiter to have a little bit more consistency with how it's catching peaks without it feeling like big peak. Now I don't have to work for a while because I just caught that one big peak. Now it's closing the gap between those really big peaks and making those big peaks a little closer to the other peaks, and just giving you a tighter sound dynamically, which is ultimately giving us a sound that feels a lot louder, because that quiet stuff is also getting the chance to now get brought up. I'm going to show you this technique. I'm going to show you how I personally go about using it. And again, I just want to give all credit to Tizio for opening my mind to this kind of ideology as far as squeezing a little bit of dynamics in the drum sound in order to get more perceived loudness out of the entire record. Your drums eat up a lot of headroom in your mix. You get more of that squeeze on those drums as far as the dynamics without destroying it. You're going to notice that probably down the line, when it comes to the entire mix, you're going to get this thing to feel a lot louder overall. Okay, so it's really, really simple. The first plugin I have on my drum bus, and this is on the drum bus, is the Gar Particle. And personally for me, you know, when it comes to the Gar Particle, I'm a really big fan of using it very sparingly. So I don't want to crank it to 100. I notice some things that I feel like takes away or does a little bit too much. So I use it tastefully, just a little bit. So I want you to listen to what this sounds like before and after on the drums. Once again, shout out Tizio for this. I never even thought about using the Gar Particle just on my drums, but it has a wonderful sound. It kind of has a way of opening things up. Before, and I have mine at 28%, no limiter on or anything like that, just kind of adding that saturation from the Gar Particle. Without first. So you just notice it feels just a little bit more exciting to me. You notice that the claps kind of get this high-end kind of like sheen, and I'm just adding and using the Gar Particle to give me a little bit of that saturation and stuff like that on the drums to really open up the drum sound, and it has a really cool sound. You don't have to use that at all. You can use a different saturator and stuff like that, but I've just been leaning towards the Gar Particle and using it not at full blast on 100%, but just a little bit of that saturation that the Gar Particle is giving me. Cool. Adds excitement. The second thing, and this is the biggest thing for me, is the limiter. So I've recently been experimenting a lot with, for instance, soft clipping on drum buses. But I started to compare soft clipping a drum bus versus limiting a drum bus. And I'll be very honest with you, I started to notice that the result that I was getting out of limiting the drum bus was a more fun sound for me, or a sound that was more pleasing to me in that regard. I noticed that when I soft clipped my drum buses, things got louder, but I also felt like the width of the drum sound took a bit of a hit. So I started to experiment more with limiting my drum bus, and I enjoyed the sound of it. I noticed that it felt like I was getting that perception of width still on my drums that I wanted. The hi-hats, the claps, all of that stuff still feel like it was retained within it. Not only that, but I found that the modern setting in the Ozone 11 limiter, the maximizer, was very pleasing to me as far as what it does to low end and how it grabs things. I'm a big fan of this. Shout out to Depth and Demetrius from $1 Million Snare to really put me onto the modern setting in this maximizer. I like it a lot. It just has a really cool way of retaining low end to me, and I just like the sound of it. It feels really, really good. It's very fast sounding, really helps my transients to stay where I want them to be, and it just has a wonderful sound. So I'm using a limiter, this is the most important part, to limit those dynamics so that I don't have to have my other limiter on the mix bus work so hard to get that same volume. I'm just doing it in steps, if that makes any sense. So I'm limiting on the drum bus so that when I go to the mix bus, I don't have to limit so much in order to get that perceived loudness, because I'm kind of taking those dynamics and squeezing them a little bit on the drums so that I'm not eating up so much headroom, but now I'm getting way more perceived volume. Okay. So I'm going to show you before and after. So long story short, as you can see, my output ceiling is set to negative 6.7. The reason why I have my drums or the output ceiling to negative 6.7 is because I want to make sure that what I am increasing as far as using the limiter to increase that perceived volume, I want to make sure that the peak is still staying the same. So I want to make sure that my peak volume is still staying the same and that I'm hearing straight up just that perceived volume increase as opposed to getting a bunch of headroom to get eaten up in the process as far as the sound. So it lets me know if I'm truly getting it louder without eating up any headroom. So before the limiter, my peaks were hitting at negative 6.7. So I set my output ceiling to negative 6.7 so that I can make sure that when I start throwing this down and I start getting that gain reduction, I know my output is still hitting at negative 6.7. So let's listen to what that sounds like. Without first, same peak. Remember, this is hitting at the same peak. So you can see that it's taking that peak as far as that kick or that snare, and it's kind of limiting, or it is limiting that peak. Now that it's limiting that peak and kind of bringing those things down as far as those moments is concerned on a more consistent basis, now the quieter stuff like the hi-hats and like the snare and all the other stuff is getting louder. And that's where that perceived volume to me is really coming from, is that low level material now getting a lot more weight inside of the entire thing. I'm going from the disparity of loudest sound, quietest sound to loud sound, quiet sound getting tighter. And now I'm able to go like this and lift it up all together. And that's where all that perception and stuff is coming from. Now, granted, be very careful with how much limiting you're doing on the drum. You could destroy your transients if you do too much. But what I say is experiment with different limiters to see what sound suits you the best. Now, I'm not also saying that soft clipping isn't the right thing to do for your drum bus, but there are two different they are two very different sounds when it comes to limiting versus the soft clipping, what I'm noticing as of lately. I like to use soft clipping as of lately more for individual elements. For instance, this is not a mixed drum sound, but I would probably go to the drums or the kick and use a soft clipper to get more perceived volume out of that one individual element, or use soft clipping to add more volume perception wise to the snare and things of that nature, just to get those dynamics a little bit tighter. And so they're not poking out as much when it comes to making that limiter try to have to catch those big transient spikes and things of that nature. I'm limiting the dynamics on a given sound in order for me to bring it up in perceived volume, and so my limiter doesn't have to work so hard. And I've been noticing I don't even need to limit so much in my mixes in order to get those loud songs or those loud luffs that I know some of you are looking for. So that's really the technique as far as everything, and that's the ideology behind it, is limiting dynamics on my drum sound in order to increase the perceived volume, have it more controlled, and now my lead limiter or my mix bus limiter doesn't have to work so hard in order to achieve the same exact volume. It's a really fun technique. Again, I can't say this enough. Shout out to TZO for kind of putting me onto this. This has been a massive game changer for me, and it was one of the main things I started to realize that is stopping me, or at the time that was stopping me from getting my songs louder. There are 1,000 different ways to get your songs louder and things of that nature, but I just wanted to throw one at you that could possibly be a culprit in your sound. So I hope you enjoyed that tutorial. Please make sure you comment, like, and subscribe. Also remember, you can become a paid member of this channel where you get a bunch of free goodies, a bunch of exclusive episodes from the My Audio Nerds podcast, Money in Our Store, the VIP Gold Edition Rosetta EQ, members only live streams, a bunch of really cool things. Make sure you also follow us at Help Me Devon for updates and things of that nature. And until next time, y'all.